Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader and today we're reviewing Disunited Nations, The Scramble for Power in an Ungoverned World, written by Peter Zeihan in 2020. So this is Peter Zeihan's third book that he wrote alone about the American withdrawal from the global system and its consequences, and I must say this was a very disappointing read for me. Most of this book is basically a rehashing of what he said in book 1 and 2. Some things he goes more in depth with, but there isn't that much new analysis. A lot of what he's talked about with China and Japan and Germany and the USA and Russia in here have been talked about in previous books. Same thing with Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey. So what I'm gonna do with this book review is I'm gonna skip over a lot of the content discussed in this book, since it's already been discussed in previous Peter Zeihan books and I don't want to repeat myself. So if you want to learn about some part of this book, just watch my previous book reviews, The Accidental Superpower and The Absent Superpower. Those are much better books with actually fresh ideas. But there are a few fresh ideas, so I'm gonna talk about them here. So Peter Zeihan talks about two models of ruling the world, and you have the American model, which is the order we have today, and then you have the British model, which is an imperial model. So the American model is that you are able to ensure physical and maritime security. Physical security means that your defense treaty with someone actually is valid. So for example, the defense treaty with South Korea, that means the USA is ready to fight in the Korean War. The defense treaty with NATO in Europe is about the USA ready to defend Europe from the Soviet Union with nukes. And ensuring maritime security is having a strong navy, able to keep everyone playing by the rules, so enforcing kind of free trade rules. This requires super carrier fleets, which is groups of aircraft carriers with surrounding ships to protect them. And these are able to project power across the world. And only the United States have effective super carriers. China, France, Italy, they don't really have functional ones. You have countries that have super carrier fleets, but only the United States is functional. And only the UK and Japan, apart from the United States, are able to create future super carrier fleets. Then the United States offers free trade around the world, markets, as an incentive to play by the rules, so you have development through that. They also maintain a global currency, the US dollar, and only the dollar is going to be able to be a global currency, so the Chinese yuan or the euro are not going to be able to replace the US dollar as the global currency. And China can do none of these things, so they cannot become a global hegemon like the United States kind of was. Then you have the second model, which is the British imperial model, and this includes having a strategically unassailable position. So for example, being an island, the UK is an island in Europe, which is how they have been able to project power throughout Europe during several centuries. You also need a potent, flexible navy to be able to defend your island, and to be able to win wars you need massive technological advantage. So that was how the British were able to create a giant empire. They had massive technological advantage over the people they conquered, which is why the British model no longer works, since now there's no country that's that much technologically superior to another. You have differences, but the difference between Iranian and British technology, for example, is no longer that big. And the thing with these models of how to rule the world is that no one will be able to do so anymore. So Peter Zeihan believes that this world order of free trade and security will collapse, and not even the United States is capable of maintaining it. Then he talks about what are the prerequisites of a successful country. So first of all, it has to be territorially viable. So this includes having internal water systems such as rivers, which facilitates trade and development within your country. You also need a temperate climate so you can grow food. And this is, for example, the Great Plains in the United States. You also need a coastline so it's easy to trade with the world and import the new technologies and also export stuff. Then you need to have easily defendable borders. So this could include, for example, mountains. But the best thing is having oceans. So the United States is in the best position as they have oceans on both sides of them, the Pacific and the Atlantic, which means that it's almost impossible for people in Asia or in Europe to invade the United States. You also need energy. So the United States and Argentina, they have shale, Russia has oil, and those prerequisites are filled by very few countries. So China does not fill all of these. The United States does, and you have a few countries that kind of fill them, but the United States fills them most effectively. Peter Zeihan goes on a tangent here talking about green energy, so solar and wind. And basically you need to have a certain climate to have green energy being effective. And that's true for both solar and wind energy. So here Peter Zeihan lists the countries that have the potential to successfully use solar or wind energy. in the coming decades. So for both solar and wind, you have the USA, Argentina, South Africa, and Australia. For only solar, you have Mexico. And then for wind, you have the UK and Denmark. That's it. All other countries need oil or natural gas or coal, according to Peter Zeihan. And even these countries, it's gonna take decades before they can develop their green technologies effectively. One country that Peter Zeihan talks a lot about in this book is France. And France has decent borders, so they have the mountains, the Pyrenees with Spain, and the Alps with Italy, which are good borders. They also have a couple of seas, so they have the North Sea on their western coast, and then they have the Mediterranean Sea on their southern coast. And they also have a bunch of rivers, which facilitates development. And the unique thing with France is that their national identity has been based on égalité, fraternité, liberté, which is a thing reserved for French people, which means people of French origin. And it maybe could include other white people, but it basically excludes Africans or Arabs. So that means that you have a minority in France from North Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa, who are not integrated, and this creates strife in France between the French people and the non-white people who live in France. And Peter Zeihan believes that Europe is going to face several crises, but that France is the exception to the rule with this. Then Peter Zeihan has several chapters on different countries in the Islamic world, so I'm gonna sum up some new points he's brought up in this book. So first, with Iran, they're gonna become the regional leader as they're surrounded by a bunch of failed states, kind of. Then you have Saudi Arabia. As the United States has shale, they no longer need Saudi oil, so the USA no longer wants to be a security guarantor to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia sponsors terrorism that has killed many Americans, such as 9/11. Many more Americans have died from Saudi-sponsored terrorism than Iranian-sponsored terrorism. And then the closest replacement as a security guarantor to the United States for Saudi Arabia would oddly be Israel. Now, Israel has a very good army, and they have an interest in keeping the Middle East split up. So they don't want a regional hegemon. And Israel has been pretty good at forming alliances with countries that should hate them. So Peter Zeihan calls Jordan a satellite to Israel. Israel has developed pretty good relations with countries such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Oddly, the security guarantor for Saudi Arabia could be Israel, but Israel does not have the capacity to defend them that much. And then you have Turkey, who's becoming a regional player in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Caucasus, and in the Middle East. And the new content here in this book that Peter Zeihan talks about is that Turkey is going to take a bunch of Greek islands, so they're gonna take Cyprus, which has a large Turkish Muslim minority there, and they're gonna take a lot of other Greek small islands that previously belonged to the Ottoman Empire. They won't take mainland Greece, they don't care about that region. Moving on to Brazil, Peter Zeihan talks about that the recent development in Brazil in the last 30 years has been dependent on this world order backed by the USA, as Brazil grows agriculture through heavy use of fertilizers that are imported and through heavy foreign financing. Brazilian exports only succeed thanks to foreign financing, and if that is gone, then Brazil will decline. This means returning to the previous system in Brazil, where they're not really a united nation. Instead, local oligarchs govern different states, only caring about themselves, and the workers are screwed over. This is a large history of Brazil, so this is just returning to the previous status quo. Some provinces such as Sao Paulo and Rio Grande will be fine. Others will decline badly. There's a difference between Brazilian decline and Eurasian disaster. Then Peter Zeihan talks about Argentina, and you can see Argentina basically as a mini USA in the good fortune they have in demographics and geography and things like that. So Argentina has very good defendable borders. They have a mountain chain, I think, with Chile, for example, and then north of them you have some natural barriers that basically prevent invasion from other countries. The only possible countries that could attack them are Paraguay and Uruguay, and they're much smaller than Argentina, so that's not gonna happen. Argentina has plenty of resources, so they have shale, they have agricultural products, they have different minerals, which is going to successfully make them the regional hegemon in South America. And what trade Brazil still has will partially be with Argentina, actually. Argentina has also very good demographics. Now, there's one caveat to all of this. Argentina just needs to switch to some decent, conducive policies or politics, as the Peronism, socialism, and fascism that has dominated Argentina has stopped development from occurring. But if you get some decent governance in Argentina, then they are destined to be a success story. Now the thing is, do I believe that Argentina will get decent governance anytime soon? Probably not. They've inflated their currencies multiple times. They have policies that cause foreign investors wanting to flee. They have had sovereign debt defaults, I believe. yeah, I'm not optimistic at all about Argentina, much less so than Peter Zeihan is. So this is an example where, yeah, you can have the best geography, the best resources, the best demographics, but if you don't have the right politics or economics, you're not advancing. The reason the USA succeeded is not just because of geography or demographics, it's also because of good politics and economics. Now let's move on to the USA and some domestic politics there. So Peter Zeihan talks about the failure of the Democratic and Republican coalitions. In the Republican Party, the populists have become dominant now, disregarding the national security conservatives, the business people. So even though the Republicans are controlled by the populists, this is just a minority. 2/3 of the Republicans don't want this. Then you have the Democrats, which has been a coalition of different minority groups, so women, blacks, Hispanics, union people. But the thing is, they want different things. Peter Zeihan basically describes the different groups here. So you have women who are center-right but socially liberal, and then you have blacks and Hispanics who are center-left but socially conservative. So these coalitions of Republicans and Democrats don't work. These factions are not meshing well together. They're actually switching sides. So for example, a lot of union people have hopped over to the Republicans, but these coalitions will reorganize eventually. It will just take some time. And what effect does this have on the world? Well, the United States has contradicting priorities. So for example, we hate Iran, but Iran is fighting the country that's causing all the terrorism, Saudi Arabia. So these contradicting policy goals in the United States leads to countries around the world being confused with what the United States want. And this causes a bigger and bigger rift between the United States and other countries. And also, foreign policy is centralized in the United States. It's basically controlled by the president. This means that what foreign policy is basically his whims. So it's kind of unpredictable. One current trend is global disengagement, according to Peter Zeihan. So for example, the United States is fed up with terrorism, with fighting it. So they have withdrawn from the Middle East. Before you had hundreds of thousands of US troops there. Now you have tens of thousands instead. And it will likely decline. And this global disengagement will have negative consequences for the United States in 30 years when you have a new regional hegemon that is gonna pick a fight with the USA, possibly. But that's down the line. Short term, according to Peter Zeihan, there's nothing bad about this global chaos for the United States. Actually, the United States wants global instability, according to Peter Zeihan. And in conclusion to this, you're gonna have a global ungoverned disorder around the world, with a few exceptions. And those are the new ideas in Peter Zeihan's book, Disunited Nations. So how would I rate Disunited Nations by Peter Zeihan? I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. There is some interesting information talked about here, but a lot of things is just repetition of Peter Zeihan's previous work in The Absent Superpower and The Accidental Superpower, The End of Russia and China. Peter Zeihan's already covered that in detail in previous books. The potential wars in the Middle East, that's already been covered by Peter Zeihan in previous books. The rise of Turkey, the end of Germany, all of these things Peter Zeihan has talked about in previous books. And in this book, he talks about them using more words in a less concise way. So you have some interesting ideas here, with him giving a lot of historical background. And he's anachronistic kind of with believing that, okay, you had this historical trend, it's going to return now. No, that's not really true. And also another thing, Peter Zeihan believes before the US imposed order, post-World War II, you did not have free trade. You had free trade in the 19th century under Pax Britannica. So Peter Zeihan has some historical misconceptions here. He misunderstands some things about economics. He emphasizes too much the importance of exports. He doesn't really understand how consumers work. Him explaining green energy in this book, that's interesting. And learning about the situation in Brazil is also interesting. But he's way too optimistic about Argentina. And now that I think about it, I think that he's too pessimistic about the world. The more I reflect on Peter Zeihan's work, the more I question whether will really China collapse in the coming 10 years? Countries are often a lot more resilient than people believe. And will the world go into disorder just because the United States withdraws? Maybe. But I don't believe that the United States is gonna withdraw from this world system. And you have assumptions here that countries that are currently democracies are going to become bloodthirsty maniacs that are gonna start killing people. So a lot of what Peter Zeihan talks about is implausible to me. It's theoretically possible, but it's highly unlikely. There is still some good analysis in this book, but most of this book is just poor repetition of what he's talked about previously, and he also has some mediocre analysis in this book. So overall, this is a 6 out of 10. I will eventually read Peter Zeihan's 4th book, but this 3rd book is a great disappointment. I really enjoyed his first 2 books. So if you want to read Peter Zeihan books, I do not recommend Disunited Nations. I recommend you to check out Accidental Superpower and The Absent Superpower. If you want those two books together, kind of, then maybe Disunited Nations, but it's written in a much more poorer way. Peter Zeihan is still funny. This is still an entertaining book to read, but Disunited Nations is a mediocre contribution to geopolitics. If you enjoyed this book review and actually want to learn about a good Peter Zeihan book, then I would recommend you to check out my book review of The Absent Superpower. Here you learn about the Shale Revolution and 3 coming possible wars. Anyways, I'm David Reader, and I will see you readers next time.